Good afternoon and welcome to the World Leaders Forum at Columbia University. This afternoon our guest is the President of the Republic of Ecuador, Rafael Correa. The President is joined by Ecuador's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Francisco Carrion-Mena. President Correa, Ambassador Carrion-Mena, welcome to Columbia and thank you for being with us today. There has been great interest and, as I believe you know, some amount of controversy in anticipation of the President's speech on, quote, media and democracy in Latin America. Since 2003, the World Leaders Forum has provided the Columbia community with an unparalleled opportunity to engage in open debate with heads of state and world leaders. These events are emblematic of our university's mission and core values. Each time we host a world leader, we are reminded that the challenges discussed by our guest and the policies a nation adopts in response to its problems can be understood only in their historical and cultural context. The belief that the world must be viewed through the eyes of people from every nation and every part of the globe is part of the essence of the World Leaders Forum and informs a great deal of what is happening at Columbia today. Yet this embrace of cultural specificity in no way precludes our university's commitment to universal values and human rights. One example of this commitment is the Cabot Prizes awarded annually by Columbia to honor the best and most courageous journalists covering the Americas. Now in its 73rd year, the Cabot Prize is the oldest international award in journalism. The conversations made possible by the World Leaders Forum urge us to consider how best to preserve our allegiance to core principles, even as we celebrate the essential roles of culture, history, and national sovereignty in understanding the world, but also how to create a workable and viable global society. Today's speech by President Correa will present us with this familiar and important tension once again. Since his election in January 2007, President Correa has brought stability to a nation that has been governed by a rapid succession of 8 different leaders in 10 years. He has funded programs to reduce inequality and raise the standard of living for Ecuador's poor. And he has improved the country's network of roads and highways. His re-election by a wide margin in 2009 was hailed as an endorsement of his economic program and a validation of his leadership. And today, in Ecuador, he remains a popular and widely admired leader. President Correa has also endured widespread criticism for his treatment of Ecuador's print and broadcast media, and for policies antagonistic to freedom of speech and press, it is said. Under his leadership, the combination of expanded government ownership of media outlets, judicial reforms calling into question the independence of the courts, and the creation through popular referendum of a panel empowered to fine and censor journalists without trial is viewed by many as undermining the ability of Ecuador's media to hold the government accountable. The criminal prosecution in Ecuador of the directors and an editor of a 90-year-old newspaper has caused the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights to say that legal action, quote, constitutes a grave warning to any citizen or media outlet that has opinions about public officials that could be considered offensive, thus obstructing processes that are natural and necessary in any democracy. Given my own personal interest in the subject of global press freedom, I am especially interested in hearing President Correa's account of these very serious concerns. Students of the jurisprudence of free expression will recognize Ecuador's laws as another form of seditious libel. Such laws, which make criticism of government officials a crime, typically have been adopted by emerging democracies or other societies seeking to extinguish threats to a fragile political structure. To be honest, these laws have also figured prominently in our own constitutional history. From the Seditious Libel Act of 1798 to the Espionage Act, adopted shortly after U.S. entry into World War I, and including rulings of our own Supreme Court upholding these laws on certain occasions in the past, the U.S. has had its own experience with translating society's fears into intolerance towards any form of government criticism. But over time, we have come to see the wisdom of repudiating this course of action. Through this experience, the lesson we have learned is that the impulse to forbid government criticism has always later been understood to be an abdication of our society's pledge to live by reason, to confront dissent with courage, and to be temperate in dealing with misbehavior. Ecuador's recent history presents a recognizable conflict, therefore. A president or prime minister insists on a certain course of action in order to lift up a people, protect a country from untold hardships, and build a bright future due the nation's citizens. And observers ask, can the pursuit of these laudable goals ever justify discarding bedrock values such as freedom of speech and open debate? What is a fair price for abandoning these principles? These are the very questions being raised in many quarters about Ecuador's current path. Mr. President, thank you for engaging these weighty issues here at Columbia. Please join me in welcoming President Correa.
Dear students, professors, authorities of Columbia University, ministers and government officials of Ecuador, Mr. Lee Bollinger, President of Columbia University. Dear President, I am afraid to tell you that you are wrong. Perhaps you read Ecuadorian newspapers. The lawsuit that I filed against Diario El Universo is not using a special law protecting a public official, a government official, no. It's the common law protecting any citizen's honor, dignity, etc. There are special laws in Ecuador protecting government officials, but we are not using them. This is a lie published by some Ecuadorian newspapers, okay? Well, I think, I know this is a very hot topic to speak about media, democracy, etc. So I hope you can, and you you will be able to understand my Spanish English. And later, we will see if we have time in order to have a little session of questions and answers. Vulnerable societies, media and democracy in Latin America. Dear friends, sometimes I shudder when I think about how vulnerable our societies are. Do you realize that often what we think about people whom we don't even know, a great deal of decisions we make regarding our families, our businesses, or what we think about alleged facts of national and international life, like my lawsuit against El Universo, is not with a special law protecting government officials, it's with the common law protecting any citizen in our country. How this information depends on what a handful of communication media tell or fail to tell us. Although this is a worldwide issue, in Latin America the problem is much more serious due to the fact that media monopolies are family-owned. They have serious ethical and professional deficiencies, and they shamelessly participate in politics. In Ecuador, national print media, TV networks, and radio stations are owned by a half-dozen families. The largest national newspaper, El Universo, belongs to front companies in the Cayman Islands, a tax haven, when you don't really go to pay taxes or participate in transparent financial endeavors. When I took office in 2007, 5 out of 7 national TV stations were owned by bankers. You can imagine what happened when we wanted to put into place bank regulation measures. In general, the common practice was always to create an economic emporium and use the media not to inform, but to defend the emporium's interest, to create an economic emporium, to buy some media, and to use this media not to inform, to defend the emporium's interest. The lack of objectivity, the absence of contextualization, and biased information are, to say the least, pathetic. As president, I am confronted by some media sectors all the time. So, if I get bit by a dog today, tomorrow that newspaper or journalist will be interviewing the dog. They don't understand the idea of telling the truth, only the truth, and nothing but the truth, in order to avoid any possibility of deceit. There are some things that might seem trivial for North Americans, given their media culture, which is also a reflection of an important characteristic of the Anglo-Saxon culture. In the Anglo-Saxon culture, lying is unnatural, and in the media, if a journalist lies, he will probably never be allowed to practice journalism again. Unfortunately, one of the main problems for the development of Latin America is the lack of love for truth. The media lie, claiming freedom of speech. Politicians lie, to sound clever. People lie in everyday life for just about anything. People lie, and lie. In the media, believe it or not, we are told that we must even tolerate lies on behalf of freedom of speech. This means that they defend lies on behalf of freedom, forgetting that even the gospel says that only the truth shall set you free. We are not intolerant of the media. What we don't tolerate are the lies. And in Latin America, the media lie under the protection of the freedom of speech. Their participation in politics is shameless. On August 10th, a national holiday in which the president of the country must present his annual report to the Congress, all 5 national newspapers published full-color front and back pages with the exact same accusation. There is no freedom of speech in Ecuador. It makes you think, as the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano said, that they have such absolute freedom of expression that they can publish that there is no freedom of expression. Just like during the days of Spanish colonization, when, in order to keep us under mental and spiritual colonialism, we were told that criticizing the king was criticizing God. Today, we are told that questioning the media's businesses means attacking freedom of speech. This is as absurd as to say that criticizing the president means attacking democracy. Freedom of speech that is reduced to a so-called free press, quotation, which, without ethics or professionalism or adequate social control, is reduced to simple free enterprise, where searching for profit or power, it is the media who decide what information to tell us, what information not to tell us, and how to tell us this information. In this way, freedom of speech is nothing more than the will of the media owners. It is freedom for them, not for the large majority, because we are enslaved by what they want to tell us and by what they want to hide from us. The focus of the debate is not freedom of speech. Come on, the focus of the debate is not freedom of speech, since we are the first to promote, to protect it, but the ethical and technical contradiction of private for-profit businesses and political and group interests that supply an indispensable public good for society, information. This contradiction, especially when ethics and professionalism are absent, has produced, among other things, an abusive privatization of public opinion, which has been kidnapped by some media businesses, as well as the use of informative power to become illegitimate political actors in our democracies. When defending the interests of these large media outlets, we are not defending freedom of speech or human rights, but only, as usual, the privileges of big businesses. How we change this situation should be one of the biggest planetary debates. And today, I hope and I expect to contribute a bit to this important and, in my opinion, unavoidable debate. We live in a world where the media, with its media power, has tried to replace the rule of law with the rule of opinion. In the rule of law, the president leads the executive branch, Congress legislates, the courts judge. This means, among other things, prohibiting the media from issuing value judgments regarding ongoing legal proceedings, even worse, when they are involved in such proceedings, so as to not interfere in the independence that judges require. Under the rule of law, defense must take place in the courtroom, not in sensationalistic newspaper headlines, which disgracefully happens today in countries such as Ecuador. You probably know that I filed a lawsuit against an Ecuadorian newspaper for defamation. For this reason, we have been the target of the most incredible attacks. Even after being appealed, the sentence in our favor was upheld. Well, on the day after, many media outlets condemned, quotation, in those very words, condemned the court's decision. Media condemning the appellate court? By any chance, are they, like the US Supreme Court, the highest court in the land? This is crucial. Rule of opinion versus rule of law. We could even talk about the intention of creating a mediacracy opposed to democracy, since it eludes the legitimacy of universal vote, parliamentary debate, and the actions of political parties. What was proposed during the electoral campaign and what the people who are the rulers in every democracy ordered on the ballots doesn't matter. What matters is what the media approve of or disapprove of in their headlines. Recognizing this power of the media and the rule of opinion, politicians have turned into media clients, and media logic has been imposed on politics. An example of this clientelism was in countries like Ecuador, the total elimination of taxes on medicines and newsprint, a privilege in direct contradiction with their condition of private for-profit businesses. Our media like to say that they are free press. Perhaps, for sure, before our government, there were free of taxes press. Of course, when our government forced these businesses to pay taxes and duties on imported newsprint, they call this an attack on freedom of speech. Other examples of this clientelism and media logic in policy and in politics are countries like Guatemala, where journalists have even been granted a special court jurisdiction. Another point for debate. The first one, rule of law versus rule of opinion. Another point for debate. Should media be the counterpower of governments, as they frequently define themselves? In this case, we should ask ourselves, what kind of legitimacy could a political actor have in democracy when his only virtue was having money to buy a printing press? If they like balance of power so much, what is the counterpower of the major powers that be on Latin America? The media. If they are indeed the counterpower, wouldn't a basic sense of decency demand them to express their political position in such an explicit manner that readers, viewers, or listeners can clearly see that such media outlets are not informing, but instead practicing politics? However, the real debate is whether or not the media should participate in politics. When defining themselves as a counterpower, they are defining themselves as a political actor or actors. What is worse, they are only the counterpower of some political parties. To others, they are just shameless accomplices, because at least in Latin America, the media have always been against progressive governments. A clear evidence of this is to recognize the role of the Chilean media in the fall of Salvador Allende and in Pinochet's dictatorship. It is even funny. They define themselves as the counterpower, that is, as political actors. However, they do not tolerate a political response. If the media defame, misinform, or slander our governments, it is called freedom of speech. If a president dares to answer back, it is an attack against freedom of speech. This means that some people have more freedom than others. Just as it would be absurd to deny the important role that the media have had throughout history as a pillar of the ascension of modern democracy, it would be impossible to deny their growing political actions in global democracies, especially in Latin America, as well as the perverse consequences that this invasion has caused in the action and scope of politics. Felix Ortega, a Spanish sociologist, said not so long ago that over time, and when assuming a role that is not theirs, the media have tended to undermine the basis of political legitimacy that democratic governments require. At the same time, they have greatly affected the guidelines of coexistence and cohesion of society. Frequently, the media have been considered to be the fourth power that Montesquieu forgot. The problem is that it is a power without a counterpower, with no democratic legitimacy, that is handling something as essential as information, and being private businesses, defending not common well-being, but in individual interest, well, is a very dangerous for power. Another element for debate is whether or not information can be discretional. This might sound trivial, given the North American media tradition that considers this possibility unacceptable. But in Latin America, the media think that because they are private businesses, they can decide discretionally what to inform and what not to inform to the public, a decision that is the closest thing to manipulation. Sometimes this reaches incredible extremes. In Venezuela, after the attempted coup in April 2002, once President Chavez was restored to his rightful position of authority due to pressure from the Venezuelan people, private television networks who opposed the government were showing cartoons. Another point of debate is something that is very popular in Ecuador these days, due, I repeat, to a lawsuit I won against the nation's largest newspaper. Whether or not slander should be penalized with prison time. This is slander, is a type of offense committed when freedom of speech is abused, sometimes called in Spanish crímenes de opinión or opinion infractions. While in the United States, slander is not a federal crime penalized with jail, it is penalized at least on the books in 17 states and 2 territories. But why is stealing a cell phone, a car, or robbing a house penalized with prison, while stealing someone's honor and reputation, something that is even more serious, not penalized with jail? As in most Latin American countries, slander is indeed penalized with prison. In the few cases where, defying the mythical fear of the media, the law was applied in this sense, very cleverly, the Latin American media were shocked and have sought international support to avoid being punished for their abuse, as it is happening right now in Ecuador. Not only that, but they think that since they do not agree with the law, they can disobey it. Again, this is rule of opinion versus rule of law. There are people that support the notion that because of freedom of speech and tolerance, politicians and elected officials must be willing to tolerate all kinds of attack, even those affecting their personal honor or their family's honor. This argument, besides being discriminatory and offensive toward human rights, is socially awkward. Who said that because we win an election, we become less human? We stop being a person. We stop having families. We stop having honor. On the other hand, if we take this statement as the truth, only the worst people, those who have nothing to lose, would seek public office. Not only do they hurt people, they hurt society as a whole. Thus, only the worst will come forward. Actually, things are absolutely clear, and they are only being manipulated by certain vested interests in a rule of opinion created by certain media outlets. There is no way to be mistaken about the subject, reputation, honor, etc. Just look at the Pact of San Jose or the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. Article 11, Human Rights of the Pact of San Jose. First, everyone, without exception, has the right to have his honor respected and his dignity recognized. Second, no one may be the object of arbitrary or abusive interference with his private life, his family, his home, or his correspondence, or of unlawful attacks on his honor or reputation, again, without exception. Third, everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. I repeat, my lawsuit against the Universo is not using a special law. It's using the common law that protects any citizen. Article 13, the same convention, limits to freedom of expression. First, everyone has the right to freedom of thought and expression. This right includes freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, in print, in the form of art, or through any other medium of one's choice. Who can possibly be against the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of thought? But the second part of this article, Article 13, Convention of Human Rights, Inter-American Convention of Human Rights. Second, the exercise of the right provided for in the foregoing paragraph shall not be subject to prior censorship, which is prohibited by the new Ecuadorian Constitution draft during my government, but shall be subject to subsequent imposition of liability, which shall be expressly established by law to the extent necessary to ensure A, respect for the rights or reputation of others. And no matter where you look, there is no exception for the president, government officials, or those who are hated by certain media. Everybody has the right to protect his or her honor, reputation, etc. It is clear that the state, and as a result, laws must guarantee to all persons the right to honor, as established in international treaties and in the case of Ecuador, also in our Constitution. It cannot be undermined, either on the basis of claims of freedom of expression, or even worse, on the pretext that they are government officials. Nowhere can such a peculiar exception be found. I believe this is extremely clear, and any honest person will agree with this. The issue is, therefore, how to punish these offenses. I insist, even if there are offenses punishable with prison time under state law in the US, it might still seem odd that a journalist in Ecuador is sentenced to jail for slandering the president. In Latin America as well, however, it seems very strange that there is no jail sentence for damaging a human being's honor, although there is jail for those who are charged with mistreating a dog. With all due respect, criticism for jailing someone for defamation is very ethnocentric, assuming that a society that is without a doubt successful, such as the United States, must be the benchmark for everything and everybody. Every country's laws must be aligned with its own principles, values, visions, history, culture, etc. Just as many people believe that prison time for injurious behavior is unacceptable, for us, for instance, the death penalty is unacceptable. And the death penalty is even rejected by the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. Thus, it is important to recognize that there is not one single set of laws for all countries. In this as well, we can see a certain neocolonialism at work. What developed, quotation, countries are allowed to do, our countries are forbidden to do. If in Germany, like last November, if in Germany the law bans right-wing propaganda and as a result shuts down a new Nazi radio station and more than 20 persons are jailed, charged with criminal organization and racial hate crimes, that is called civilization, quotation. But if in Bolivia, Evo Morales proposed a law forbidding racist expression in the media, it is an assault on freedom of expression. But it's because Evo Morales is supposedly untrustworthy. At the end of the day, it's nothing other than more ethnocentrism and neocolonialism. On the potential solution to the problem presented, I must acknowledge, however, that I have many more questions than answers, and that some solutions, such as state controls, may be even more harmful than the problem itself. As I said before, I believe the key problem is the ethical and technical contradiction of private, for-profit businesses and political and group interests that supply an indispensable public good for society, information. From this core problem comes the need to ensure a more democratic approach to ownership of the privately owned media and to ensure the autonomy of the media from these vested interests. To create a larger number of media not driven by market forces, that is, not-for-profit media and public sector media. And collective action by means of adequate regulation striving to align market-driven media corporations with social objectives. That is, guaranteeing the right to receive accurate, proven, timely, contextualized, plural information without prior censorship and with subsequent liability, as written in Article 18 of our Constitution. Oftentimes, private businesses that provide information, in addition to being family-owned monopolies and oligopolies, are very closely tied to other corporate interests. Very often, they have investment in business sectors that are different from the information or communication sector. In Latin America, one widespread practice, I repeat, was to create a business emporium and then set up a media company, not to inform the public, but to protect the interests of the emporium. For example, in Ecuador, the Isaiah family was the owner of more than 200 companies, among which the country's largest bank. And then they eventually bought 2 national television broadcasting stations with open signal, 1 national cable TV station, the cable TV service itself, 3 regional radio stations, and several magazines. It should be pointed out here that the bank went bankrupt as a result of fraud, and therefore the Isaiah fled from Ecuadorian justice and took refuge in Miami. Despite several requests for extradition filed by the Ecuadorian government, they continue there. Our new constitution, adopted in 2008 after a constituent assembly with members elected by universal vote and ratified in a referendum with 83% support, in another alleged assault on freedom of expression, forbids banks from holding shares in media corporations, something which here in the United States has been forbidden since 1956 as a result of the Bank Holding Act, but which in Ecuador was almost considered blasphemy. Once again, in an absolutely democratic process, in the referendum held last May 7th, the third one since our administration came to office, and despite a huge media campaign attacking this valuable instrument of democracy, the Ecuadorian people vote to separate media activities from other economic activities. This has been already included in the current antitrust law project, which has already been in place here in the United States for more than 100 years. Your antitrust law has more than 100 years. We don't have any antitrust law yet, and we sent a few days ago the project to the National Assembly. This draft law, which is being discussed in Ecuador's Congress, establishes that any shareholder with more than 6% ownership share in a media company is forbidden to have any other type of business. This is aimed at democratizing ownership of the media and preventing conflicts of interest. Of course, it is also a blow at the very core of power structures in Ecuador. And as it is easy to verify, it is widely opposed by the media, who once again are playing a political role and trying to impose upon us a rule of opinion. Furthermore, to avoid this key contradiction of a public good managed by private for-profit enterprises, where almost by definition private sector vested interests will prevail over social interests, it is necessary to diversify ownership of the media. Whereas in countries such as those in Europe, television was born as public television, before our administration in Ecuador, there were not public media, neither print, nor radio, nor television. Today, we have all of them. I would like to insist on the word public, which is different from the word government. Nevertheless, the absence of balance between public and private media is still huge. We believe that the creation and consolidation of public media at the service of the citizens is a key milestone in the effort to give a voice to those who have been neglected, to draw up another type of information agenda which focuses on issues of genuine interest, and to move away from the dictatorship of ratings and advertising. This has been a tremendous and difficult challenge because from the very start, the public media have been the target of unfair criticism, even scorn and mockery by the private sector media. Obviously, the explanation for this arrogant attitude of many of the private media lies in the fact that they thought they could never be challenged in the kingdom of their own making. In many cases, such as regarding the Telecommunication Council, which was in place before the current administration, the laws and distribution of the radioelectric spectrum frequencies were in the hands of owners and shareholders themselves of the media, while government officials merely acted as witness on honor for these business dealings, although the radioelectric spectrum is owned by the state. Finally, information, I repeat, is a public good. That is, an economic good that is available to everybody, and its use by one person should not prevent its use by others. In technical terms, these two characteristics are known as non-exclusion and non-rivalry, respectively. The problem of supplying public goods is a well-known problem in economics, and you have an outstanding economic department. There are here students in economics. They go to know very well what I am talking about. This is a very well-known problem in economics. And as you well know, well, I am myself an economist, yet I am still a good person. And this involves what is known as market failure. To provide public goods is a market failure. Why? In other words, that market-driven businesses will not supply this good efficiently. Nevertheless, economics has hardly conducted any studies at all on the matter of supplying public goods from the standpoint of power, which involves a normative analysis of the regulatory framework, which some believe must not be considered by a science such as economics, which, by mistreating mathematics, tries to pretend it is a hard science. Supplying. This is a contradiction. Social science trying to pretend to be hard science. Oh, come on. Try to understand human society without checking power relations inside the society. Supplying a public good, such as information, bestows power. The good or bad quality of information affects all of society. It impacts decision-making by the public every single day. Perception of events, appraisals, and opinions. It can contribute to the progress of history, or it can impede action and thought, disorienting its subjects when it is urgent to promote the development of collective actions. That is why, in supplying this good, regulations are required to prevent the abuse of power and foster greater citizen control over something that can either help or severely undermine society. That is why it is urgent to have in Ecuador a new communication law, which from its sphere of influence can also help both democratize and demonopolize the media, with the equitable distribution of radio and television frequencies between the private sector, the public sector, and communities, and harmonization of the regulatory framework as required in the 21st century, as already established in Ecuador constitutional framework, constitution draft during our administration. For the past 2 years in Ecuador, a communication law has been discussed. A law that extends beyond simple the media. It's a communication law, not just a media law. This law has been systematically blocked by the media and their advocates in Ecuador Parliament. In a new display of the rule of opinion, they call this law the gag law, although there have already been 18 different drafts. They have highlighted it as a new attempt by the government to control a free press. Even though the bill is a legislative initiative that I haven't even seen yet. In addition, it's a mandate of the Constitution ratified by the results of the voting in the referendum held on May 7th. In fact, they are brazenly violating the Constitution in force since October 2008, because in its first transitory provision, the Constitution provided one year to have a new communication law to enforce the citizens' right to receive not only information, but also free, intercultural, inclusive, diverse, and participatory communication in all sectors of social interaction, by any means or forms, in their own language and using their own symbols, as established in Article 16 of our Constitution. In many Latin American countries, including Argentina, Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, there is now a fierce struggle to change the concentrated models of communication. Nevertheless, repeatedly, every attempt to democratize communication and broaden the exercise of citizens' right to information has triggered the reaction of a significant part of private media in all of these countries. To this end, the media have wasted no time in rejecting, without any critical reasoning, all proposals aimed at regulating the media and communication sector, exaggerating a fictitious claim that basic liberties will be undermined, while avoiding any debate or thinking about the matter rationally, pounding away with the rhetoric of persuasion, disguised as intellectual argument, pretending, as Ignacio Ramonet says, that repetition is equal to proof. These have been the strategies employed by the so-called free and independent media to dismiss not only government proposals, but also those made by citizens, social leaders, academics, and even certain communicators who have aligned themselves with these proposals. As a result, they have neglected to promote a real public debate to try again to impose on us a rule of opinion. Dear friends, dear students, the concept of freedom has been greatly abused and misused throughout the history of humankind. Latin America knows this very well. Every coup or invasion was made on behalf of freedom. Soon, we will celebrate 1 year of the coup attempt in Ecuador on September 30, 2010, which resulted in 5 deaths and about 300 injuries. The promoters of this coup met a few days before in Miami to talk about freedom and to discuss the fact that after Correa was gone, 21st century socialism in Ecuador will be gone. Supposedly protecting freedom. Dictatorships on the continent kidnapped, tortured, made disappear, and killed tens of thousands of human beings. By the way, they also invoke the name of God in doing so. In 1776, the United States Declaration of Independence, one of the most beautiful documents written by human king, said, "We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Beautiful words, aren't they? But the main author of this declaration, Thomas Jefferson, owned over 200 slaves. Jefferson was without a doubt a great man, but it was beyond his understanding that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was also meant for his slaves. In fact, independence, quotation, was declared, but freedom for slaves came only 1 century later, after a civil war. And equal rights came with the abolition of racial segregation laws only 2 centuries later, with violence and several assassinations, such as the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. Something similar is happening today in our America. For our elites, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is only for them. Equality is only for them. Today, with the revolutionary processes that are taking place in Latin America, everything is changing. It is a mistake to analyze what is happening in our America from the point of view of the current reality of the United States. It is better to imagine the United States that was fighting for the civil rights or even for the liberation of slaves. The people of Latin America are fighting for their liberation. Let's learn something from history. Let's remember what the role of the Southern media was when people were fighting for civil rights. And you will understand why our radical change governments face an illegitimate political opposition of some media that are manipulating us on behalf of the freedom of speech. Thank you very much. café. Okay. You have another one. I didn't see it.
Thank you very much, President.
You're very
Correa,
welcome.
for that interesting speech. We have a few moments for questions and answers. I will try to see hands raised. In each of the aisles, you'll find someone with a microphone. So if you have a question, just go stand right next to that person and we'll rotate this side, that side, and then to the balcony. So our first questioner is right here.
Hello, I'm Ruben Saunders, a student in Columbia College. Thank you for your speech, Mr. President. I'm just wondering how you can maintain the independence of public media and not have it be an ideological counterpart of the private media.
Yes, this is a very good question, a very complex one. You know, at the end of the day, that depends on how you vote, you know, because always dishonest government can use the public media in favor of their political parties, etc., political interests. So there are ways to decrease this danger. For instance, to have clearly in the law, and we are discussing that in the communication law, the council directing this public media. So you have executive director from the citizen, not from the government. Well, this kind of problem could be decreased, but always you're going to have this danger. For this reason, as I said, perhaps sometimes the solution could be worse than the problem, you know? Okay.
Thank you.
Carlos Lauria, Committee to Protect Journalists in New York. We recently visited Ecuador and did a...
You will be always welcome, sir.
Yeah, very critical report about the situation in Ecuador. We think there are many restrictions for journalists and disagree with you.
What kind of restriction?
For example, Mr. President,
I can know, I may know.
The ratification, the sentence against El Universo was ratified on Tuesday.
But come on, this is the legal framework of our country.
The question is, how can you justify absolute freedom of expression, like you said, and tolerance, when you yourself, President of Ecuador, have urged courts to imprison journalists and have them paid multi-million-dollar in fines just because you didn't like an opinion, a critical opinion? And I disagree with you. In Latin America, there's a lot of countries that are towards the criminalizing defamation. And examples are Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. And the inter-American system thinks that laws that penalize defamation contradict international standards as said by the Inter-American Commission. Thank you.
Sir, you are lying and you are a liar. I am not influenced in court. This is a lie. Perhaps you used to read Ecuadorian newspaper, what they got to do if they are losing the lawsuit. So the only thing to show independence in the judiciary system is to lose. But we are the truth. We are right. So why we have to lose the lawsuit? So you are lying, that is not true. And secondly, opinion against a lie. Again, a lie. Do you think it's opinion to write? President Correa ordered to shoot against a hospital full of civil people without preventing, without information. And he's a criminal of less humanity. This is an opinion. This is defamation, come on. This is a slander. And if you don't want to respond to the judiciary system, well, you have to pass a reform to the Constitution telling that journalists must be above the law. But as long as now, right now, everybody in Ecuador must respond when they commit an offense to the law. We have a state with the rule of law, not the rule of opinion, sir. Okay? Thank you very much.
we have time for a couple of more questions. Is there a question on the balcony?
I have a question. I mean, I'm here online, and
Sorry.
I'm co-author of a book called Netizens on
Sorry.
the history and impact of
Please,
Usenet and the
stay-
Internet, about the Internet.
I'm just trying to make sure that everyone gets a turn, and there is a
But we're
microphone.
online, and you told us to come online, and now
Yes,
you're
and if you'll wait your turn, I will call on you.
Well, that's
Is there a question on top? No, then we'll go back over here.
not up there, just here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming, Mr. President. My name is Benjamin Lewis. I'm a first-year graduate student at the School of International and Public Affairs here at Columbia. I guess I have to take exception to your distinction between the rule of law and the rule of opinion, because in the end, it's very hard to distinguish fact from opinion, and almost everything is going to be considered opinion. So when you have freedom of expression, that's not just freedom of fact, that's freedom of opinion. What fact is and what opinion is depends on the person. So the thing is, when a government makes a policy, they're not instituting fact. Everyone can give their opinion on it. So the courts give their opinion, and other people can give their opinion. And if they're doing that peacefully, then that's what freedom of expression is representing your opinion peacefully. And the thing is, the fact and opinion is so hard to distinguish. Here in the U.S., our own president, President Barack Obama, was called a Muslim socialist born outside of the United States. Almost all of those can be proven not fact. But the thing is, we deal with that, right? Because that's something that needs to be protected. Opinion and fact is so hard to distinguish. You can't say that only fact is allowed and opinion is not. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. I agree completely with you. And for me, United States is a very interesting country. I love a lot this country. I studied 4 years in this country because it's a country where you can insult the president and nothing happens, but if you mistreat your dog, you go to jail. It's a very interesting country. Anyway, well, perhaps everybody in Ecuador can disagree with law, but in a rule of law state, you can disagree, but you cannot disobey. That is what are trying to do some journalists. Anyway, your question is a very complex question, and it is an ongoing discussion, eternal ongoing discussion. Where are the limits? Opinion and facts. Yes, there is a overlapping where it is very difficult to separate opinion from facts, okay? But there are cases where it is very clear. If I tell you, you are tall, you are strong, well, this is perhaps my opinion. But if I say you are a drug dealer, that is not opinion. This is an accusation. This is defamation. And that is what every day some media in Ecuador does. So there is not a misunderstanding here. I understand your question. There are overlapping regions, if you want, to separate facts from opinion. But there are cases very clear. You know, when someone accuses you of assassination to shoot people, this is not an opinion. This is slander. Okay?
For those of you who are online, I think we have time for just one question on each side. So
my name is Rhonda Haubin, and I'm co-author of a book called Netizens on the history and impact of Usenet and the Internet. And I think what you're saying is very important, not only for Ecuador, but for the U.S. as well, because we had the situation where there was supposedly weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And the result was that there was an invasion based on something that was untrue. And so maybe Barack Obama can have something said against him. And the U.S. isn't invaded because of it. But Iraq was invaded, and Libya's been invaded by things many people believe were not true. And so I think you're posing a tremendously important question, not only for Ecuador, but for countries around the world and for the UN. We need the difference of facts and opinion. And so my question to you
democratizing media.
Yeah, my question to you is, there's something that I'm part of, the point of netizens, of somehow not only the business interests having access to the media, but many more people around the world. And there's something that's developing called netizen journalism, where people online are trying to build a better journalism, a different journalism. And I'm wondering if you see those kinds of efforts as something that you know about and that you see as helpful towards towards the problem you're presenting to us, and if there's a way we can be helpful with the netizen journalism towards putting input into broadening who gets to be online and the debate that goes on, so things that aren't facts get answered, and there's an alternative viewpoint out there.
There are, madam. I talk about that. Well, the challenge is to democratize media ownership, okay, in order to have better information and communication. And also to create not driven market media corporations. And we are working very hard in Ecuador for that. For instance, we already distribute among indigenous community 14 radio stations. They never before could be able to reach a frequency because there was corruption. And now 14 indigenous community have their own radio station. In the new communication law, we are discussing, and this is our position, to divide, to distribute frequencies, radioelectric frequencies equally. That means 1/3 for private media, 1/3 for public media, and 1/3 for non-profit corporation and communities, indigenous community, etc. So we have several projects going on in Ecuador with this goal. Okay.
Sorry, last question. Oh, there's one on top. Yes.
Hi, up here.
Yes. Never mind.
Okay, primero que nada, muchas gracias. Fue un placer escuchar ese discurso. Segundo, sí estoy de acuerdo con usted en que necesita diversificar la calidad de la prensa.
Thank you very much, and I agree that it's necessary to diversify the sources of information.
Oh, thank you. Sin embargo, siento que también tienen que haber medidas para tratar de disminuir el poder que tiene el sector privado.
I also agree that it's necessary to take steps to diminish the power of the private sector.
Además de añadir más personas que diversifiquen la prensa. Simplemente porque si tenemos más personas que diversifican la prensa, pero siguen teniendo el mismo poder las mismas personas que tienen el poder de los bancos, que tienen el poder económico, no se va a lograr nada. O sea que hay que encontrar la manera también de distribuir la riqueza de Latinoamérica de manera distinta, para entonces así lograr que no todos los recursos, no toda la prensa, porque la prensa es solo una instancia del gran problema que hay en Latinoamérica.
This question suggests that in addition to diversifying the press, one needs to look into the problem that so much power and economic resources are in the hands still of the private sector.
Concuerdo totalmente contigo. La estructura de la prensa refleja la estructura de nuestros países, estructuras tremendamente injustas, concentradoras.
He agrees that I think you said he was a socialist, that concentrating power is a bad idea.
It is as easy as this. Who has the money to buy print press? Poor people or rich people? It's very clear. You know, the media is in Latin America representative of the traditional power, and they are fighting very hard in order to avoid any change, in order to not to lose their privileges.
President Correa, thank you very much for coming.
You're very welcome. This is fine.